Anwar al-Awlaki was an American-born imam who became the first U.S. citizen deliberately hunted down and executed by his own government without trial by a drone strike. New York Times national security reporter Scott Shane details the story and its significance in his new book. It's called Objective Troy, A Terrorist, a President, and the Rise of the Drone. And he joins us now for more. It's great to have you here.
Hey, great to be on with you.
I totally love the book, and I totally, after having read it, understand why you won the Gelber Prize for having the best foreign affairs book this year. It was great.
Thank you very much.
Let's just show a picture of the guy we're going to be talking about today. Here he is, Anwar al-Awlaki, born April 22nd, 1971 in Las Cruces, New Mexico. Yes, one of the most dangerous terrorists ever. Some say even more dangerous than bin Laden, was born in the USA. And one of the startling things, Scott, I got to tell you about the book was the way you compare his background with Barack Obama's. A lot of similarities. Do you want to go into it?
Yeah, that's some people have taken offense at that, and I don't want to make too much of it, but there is a very striking set of parallels having to do with their early lives. And first of all, both were born to fathers of Muslim heritage in the United States, and both fathers had come to the States for a graduate study. That's how they were Americans. They were both taken to Muslim countries as children, where they lived for some years, and then they both returned to the U.S. And partly as a result of that sort of mixed up background, I think it's fair to say they both struggled with questions of identity. And President Obama, of course, famously described his struggle with identity in his book, Dreams from My Father. And he even describes the temptation of radicalism. He describes what it's like to feel that you're coiling tighter and tighter into a coil of rage. And of course, he rejected that sort of radical temptation that he describes in his book. He embraced America, and he kind of vaulted to the top of the political system. Anwar al-Awlaki took a very different path through a series of sort of accidents in his life.
Let's pursue that for a second, because Awlaki somehow, on 9/11, 2001, says this is a terrible thing. This is a horrible thing, what's happened to the United States.
Yes.
And then somehow, over the intervening years, becomes one of the leading proponents of terrorism in the world.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Well, that's one reason I set out to write this book, is I've been writing about terrorism like a lot of other reporters since 9/11, 2001. And a question that has always preoccupied me is what brings a person to devote his life to killing dozens or hundreds of strangers? What can motivate somebody to do that? And his case, as you point out, is a particularly sort of baffling one. He spent just about half of his 40 years in the U.S. He was seemingly very happy. He began to raise a family there. He had a really strikingly successful career as a young imam. And as you say, he made a reputation after 9/11, denouncing 9/11, saying, in fact, that the particular role of American Muslims was to be a bridge between the United States and 1 billion Muslims around the world. And this guy ends up with al-Qaeda. So that was one reason I set out to write this book.
And as you point out in the book, it's his father who says, whatever happened to my son happened in America. He didn't get radicalized somewhere else. It happened in America.
Yeah, I mean, I think the radicalization had its roots in America, but what I think the father was referring to was his interest in religion. I mean, his brother told me a revealing story for his younger brother, who was sort of watching Anwar pack to go off to the U.S. He had spent his first 7 years in the States, went back with his parents to Yemen, lived there until he was 19, and then his dad said, I want you to go to college in the U.S., and he was sending him to Colorado State to study engineering. So he's packing, and his mother keeps putting in a prayer rug, and Anwar keeps taking it out, saying, kind of embarrassed, but saying, Mom, I'm going to America, I don't need this. And she would put it in, and he'd take it out. So he had no real interest in religion at that time. but it was actually at Colorado State that he fell in with some conservative older Muslim students and took, sort of embraced religion very enthusiastically, shall we say.
Didn't stop him from going to prostitutes.
No, and one of the real turns in this story is that at the height of his fame in the U.S., after 9/11, he's in the Washington Post, he's in the New York Times, he's on television, he's on the radio, and he's really sort of forging a career as a very articulate and charismatic spokesperson for Islam, sort of explaining Islam to all these baffled, to a baffled audience that kind of wants to understand, what's Islam, what's Al-Qaeda, and at the height of his fame, preaching at a conservative, big, influential congregation right outside Washington, D.C., he, it turns out, is also taking afternoons off every week or two to visit prostitutes in American hotels. He's married, he has 3 kids, and he's preaching about the sanctity of marriage.
Kind of a bit off-brand, wouldn't you say?
A bit off-brand, and so that's when a real turn in this story comes, because the FBI, it turns out, unbeknownst to him, has been following him around out of concern that perhaps he has radical ties. They satisfy themselves that he has no radical ties, but they also discover this illicit habit that he has, and he finds out that they know about his visits to prostitutes, and that causes him to leave the United States in a big hurry.
Well, here is some of what he wrought, and I'm just going to take a half a minute here to go through a bit of a list. 9/11, some recall him having closed-door discussions with 2 of the Saudi hijackers in his office. He may have also been a spiritual advisor to 3 of the hijackers. The London subway bombings in 2005, 3 of the 4 terrorists attended one of his lectures. Here in Toronto, the Toronto 18 terrorism plot in 2006, young Canadians plotting to behead the Prime Minister. They watched his videos. The 2009 Fort Hood shooting in Texas. Al-Awlaki was in touch with the shooter, denounced Muslim soldiers who fight against other Muslims. He later called the killer a hero. 2009, a young Nigerian, Umar Farouk Abdullah Matulab, so-called underwear bomber, unsuccessfully tried to detonate his explosives in a Christmas flight over Detroit. Al-Awlaki helped him with the plot. Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber, 2013, avid watcher of his videos, learned how to make the bombs from his magazine. 2015, the Charlie Hebdo brothers admitted they were inspired and financed by Al-Awlaki. Fair to say that if Al-Awlaki had not become radicalized, we would have seen significantly less terrorism over the last 15 years?
It's always hard to answer that question because you don't know what else these young guys, mostly guys, sort of going out on the internet, might have come across. But I think he sort of offered a unique combination of, first of all, a real grasp of mainstream Islam. This is a guy who had a best-selling boxed set of CDs on the life of the Prophet Muhammad, completely mainstream stuff, spoke perfect Arabic and perfect English, and had a real knack for explaining things. So he could take somebody from mainstream Islam to the notion that it is your religious obligation to go out and kill people. And I think in that way, he was a very powerful and insidious influence in many cases.
Here's how you explain it, actually, in the book. Here's an excerpt. As a Marine considers defending the United States of America to be his duty, so a young Muslim jihadi sees defending Islam and the community of believers as his duty. And if the jihadi believes the United States is at war with Islam, then killing the Americans who are fighting that war, and even the American civilians who are funding the war, suddenly becomes not monstrous, but legitimate, even noble. What do you make of that logic?
Well, I mean, obviously I'm kind of appalled by that logic, but in struggling with the question of what causes somebody to do the inexplicable, I found it very helpful to remember that we in the United States have sent off our sons and daughters to foreign lands repeatedly in recent years to fight wars, in some cases to kill civilians, not perhaps deliberately, but in every case, When they come home, they're welcomed as heroes. They're celebrated as having carried out a sort of sacred duty as patriots. And I think what Anwar al-Awlaki was able to do was to transfer people's allegiance from whatever country they were citizens of to this larger notion of the Islamic jihad, the cause, the war on behalf of Islam. And once you accept that shift of allegiance, a lot of it sort of makes sense that these guys see themselves as heroes, as fighters for Allah, as fighters for Islam, and as carrying out a kind of heroic duty.
So it suggests that this is going to continue as long as the United States is engaged in Islamic countries around the world, right?
Well, I mean, it's hard to fault governments, the U.S. government, the Canadian government, whoever it is, from taking actions to defend itself against an enemy that has declared war not just on soldiers but on civilians, on the one hand. On the other hand, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, their sort of core argument is that the United States is at war with Islam and is killing Muslims, and that's the motivator. So the U.S. reaction to that in many cases has been, in a literal sense, to kill Muslims. Whether we're talking about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan or with drone strikes.
And ignores the fact that Muslims are killing Muslims at the same time, though.
Absolutely. But still, if you are going to an impressionable young person who's gotten very enthusiastic about this cause, and you can point to, look at America, it's killing Muslims in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Pakistan, and it's your job to fight back. I think it's sort of the law of unintended consequences, but in many cases, American actions have played into the propaganda approach of Al-Qaeda.
The administration in the United States decides it has on its hands the second most dangerous man in the world, next to Osama bin Laden, and Barack Obama asks his lawyers to give him a legal opinion on whether or not he can use a drone strike to kill him. And they concluded it was okay. You consulted 32 current and former professors of constitutional law, and here's what they came back with. 11 said killing al-Awlaki was legal and constitutional. 9 said it wasn't. 12 said it depends. This is really not a black and white issue, is it?
No, it's not. That was one reason, not being a lawyer, I wanted to do that. So I wanted to get a sense of how persuasive experts on law, and especially constitutional law, found the administration's arguments. And it's still very divided opinion.
One of the things that you also ask in the book, which is a terrific question, is how is it that you need a judge to sign off on targeting an American for surveillance overseas, but you don't need a judge to sign off on targeting and killing an American overseas?
Yeah, I mean, that is sort of the nature of the law was, and I don't have the document in hand because it's still classified, but I'm absolutely sure that there is a court order that allowed them to target and eavesdrop on Anwar al-Awlaki's cell phone when they were chasing him, but they did not go to the court and seek similar approval for killing him.
And they didn't need to.
Because the law does not allow that, and in their view, they didn't need to. In their view, the U.S. Constitution requires due process of law before you deprive someone of life or liberty, and President Obama and his administration argued that there was adequate due process of law in the internal secret discussions about what this guy had done, what this guy threatened, and the danger that he represented to American security.
Let's take a look at this picture. Sheldon, you want to bring this up? Here's what did the deed. This is an MQ-1 Predator drone. This captured Barack Obama's imagination quite early, even before he became president. How come?
Yeah, this is a sort of a surprise. When he came in to office, Barack Obama had really run against a lot of George W. Bush's counterterrorism programs. He had denounced torture. He denounced secret detention. He had sharply criticized the prison at Guantanamo Bay. But he hadn't said much about drone strikes, which were still treated as fairly secret. But he surprised, I think, a lot of his fans and actually a lot of his critics by very quickly embracing the drone. And I found that actually he had given hints of that during the campaign. And part of it sort of fit in with his overall view of this conflict. He had famously opposed the invasion of Iraq in a speech in which he said repeatedly, "I'm not against all wars, I'm against dumb wars."
I think he even said that when he got his Nobel Prize.
And yes, and I think he had made clear that he was not against what he considered to be a just war or sort of a sensible war from a practical standpoint. But I think when he was running for president, he'd come to see both Afghanistan and Iraq as sort of extremely costly in money and in lives, and with little to show for it. And against a relatively small enemy hiding in remote places, he thought the drone was the right weapon to be able to pick off terrorists 2 or 3 at a time and not turn an entire country upside down. That had real appeal to this fairly young, sort of technocratic president who, coming into office was very attached to his BlackBerry. I think he saw this as the answer.
So tell us how and where al-Awlaki was eventually targeted and killed after a decision by the president.
Well, as you can imagine, when the president says, go hunt this guy down, it really motivates this huge intelligence and counterterrorism apparatus that had bulked up after 9/11. And all these agencies spent almost a year and a half looking for this guy. They took a shot at him and barely missed in May of 2011. But finally, at the end of September 2011, they caught up with him, got some tips about where he might be.
Which was where?
It was in the north of Yemen, not too far from the Saudi border, in a fairly wild area. And, the way I've been told the story, he was with 3 other guys. They kind of saw or heard the drone, ran for their vehicles, and were essentially incinerated. And so he was killed along with a fellow American, a sort of sidekick named Samir Khan, and 2 Yemeni al-Qaeda guys. Basically nothing left but the wreckage of the vehicles.
2 weeks later, they killed his son as well. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, Obama, was, I think, very pleased with the way the operation against al-Awlaki was carried out, and was infuriated when he learned that Anwar al-Awlaki's 16-year-old son, Abdul Rahman, had been killed in another drone strike. And I have been told, and I believe that it's true, that they had no idea this kid was there. They were taking a shot at 7 guys who they thought were al-Qaeda. Some of them probably were al-Qaeda, but in the group was this 16-year-old and his 17-year-old cousin who had no history of terrorism. And I think Obama knew that this would, there'd be a huge backlash against the idea of killing this teenager. A lot of Yemenis who had accepted the idea that the father was a terrorist, was trying to kill Americans, and there was sort of, kind of an eye for an eye to it, that this 16-year-old they would feel differently about, and it's true, it had a huge impact, and people were still talking very angrily about it in 2014 when I was in Yemen.
I hate to say it, but it's a great recruiting technique.
Absolutely.
For jihadis.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, when you talked to al-Awlaki's father, he clearly thought the death of his grandson was an awful miscarriage of justice. How did he feel about the death of his own son?
He denounced that as well. And, it's his own son. But I think he understood that Anwar had sort of created the situation that he found himself in. Nasser al-Awlaki, who had been Yemen's agriculture minister, he'd been chancellor of 2 universities, very distinguished, prominent man in Yemen, had actually gone to court to try to get Anwar off the kill list. And because he actually believed in the American system of justice, his lawsuit was dismissed and it didn't happen. But one reason it was dismissed is that Anwar had not sent word from Yemen that he supported this lawsuit. And that was because Anwar had basically rejected the American legal system. And so that was one reason that this sort of quest to, in his view, force the United States to live up to its own ideals actually failed.
When the president orders and finds out about a drone strike, I hate to put it this way, but how much of the gory detail does he actually get briefed on?
In Obama's case, he realized as he ramped up the drone program, even from the levels where Bush had at the end of his presidency, he insisted on having a quite direct, sort of hands-on role in the program, in part because he knew it was something new and different and risky, and he kind of wanted to have close oversight. He talked about having it on a short leash. So I think he was very thoroughly briefed. There are, in some cases, it's very hard before and after a strike to see whether you hit the right people, whether you killed civilians by accident. And so you wonder, in some cases, whether the briefing by the CIA or the military, that he got, even if it was detailed, was it completely accurate, or did they even understand, in every case who they killed?
Having now written the book, though, can you appreciate the choice that a president has? It's either send tens of thousands of men and women into battle to try to achieve an objective, or have some guy in Nevada push a button. I mean, there is something kind of Orwellian and clean about that, isn't there?
Absolutely, and it may be Orwellian, but I mean, the drone program, by most estimates, has killed maybe between 4,000 and 5,000 people in several countries, of whom maybe 10 or 20% were civilians, which is very tragic and has produced a big backlash. But if you compare it to Vietnam, let alone the firebombing of Dresden or Tokyo, or the atomic bombs dropped on Japan in World War II, it is relatively modest toll. So maybe in the eyes of history, this will look like a kind of advance in warfare.
Did you come to that conclusion yourself?
I try as a reporter to avoid committing to a particular point of view. But I think there's something to the idea that this is a lot smarter response to terrorism than sending 100,000 troops to a Muslim country for 10 years and
4,000 come home in body bags.
4,000 come home in body bags, and in the case of Iraq, several 100,000 people were killed. So it's hard not to see this as a smarter idea for all of its flaws.
Let's finish up on this, Scott. 6 months into his presidency, of course, Barack Obama gives that landmark speech in Cairo in which he, quote, I seek a new beginning between the United States and Muslims around the world. Where do you think, as a result of what you've chronicled, as a result of what's taken place over the last 7 years under his watch, where's that outreach to the Muslim world today?
Unfortunately, that really, I think, must be one of President Obama's biggest disappointments. He found it impossible to sort of reset relations with the Muslim world, and there are a lot of reasons for that that are outside, his power, including the Arab Spring and everything that's kind of come out of it. But I have to believe that, he came into office determined to end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it must be extremely depressing to him that even those, he got the troops out of Iraq, and now we've sent small numbers, but still troops into Iraq and even a few into Syria. And ditto with Afghanistan, we've sort of slowed the withdrawal, and there's really no obvious endpoint to the commitment of troops to Afghanistan. So, in that sense, I think the world has defeated him.
I guess there's one question left we haven't answered that we should. The name of the book is Objective Troy. Al-Awlaki's name is not Troy,
yes,
but that was his code name. Where did they come up with that?
That's right. If you have the misfortune to get on the U.S. military's kill list, you are called an objective, and you're given it a code name. And you would think that perhaps Troy came from Trojan horse and the idea of sort of betrayal from within. But in fact, as it turns out, the U.S. military chose its targets in Yemen, gave them code names from the names of towns in the state of Ohio. And so Anwar al-Awlaki became, when he went on the kill list, Objective Troy for Troy, Ohio.
My goodness. It's a great read, an important book, and we're really grateful you had time for us today at TVO to come in and talk about it.
Thank you, Steve.
Objective Troy, a terrorist, a president, and the rise of the drone. Scott Shane from the New York Times. Thanks, Scott.
Appreciate it.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.